So I was focused on Joe Paterno and an alleged Penn State cover-up. And as I got deeper and deeper and deeper, and I'm talking super deep into the story over the years, many, many years, and in an incredible amount of time put into this investigation, what I realized was that my initial instincts that Joe Paterno was innocent and that there was no Penn State cover-up was in fact true. But the reason why there was no Joe Paterno Penn State cover-up of Jerry Sandusky is that there were no crimes by Jerry Sandusky.
The opinions and attitudes expressed by guests on the Fountainhead Forum do not necessarily reflect the opinions and attitudes of the Fountainhead Forum or the opinions and attitudes of Chris Baker. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 288. I'm talking to John Ziegler, who's back for the fourth time. And this has been we're going to talk about something that John's been working on for quite a while. It's become one of his own personal pursuits, Jerry Sandusky, and why he believes that Jerry Sandusky is not guilty of the things that he was accused of doing. How are you, John?
I'm okay, Chris.
Okay, John. This was hit the well. It was been about 15 years now, right? I mean, Jerry Sandusky. Yeah,
a little less than 14 years in the public consciousness. The story exploded in November of 2011. And just to be clear, I don't believe or think that Jerry Sandusky is innocent. I am positive that Jerry Sandusky is innocent, and it's not even close, which is the most remarkable part of this whole thing.
Well, yes, you raised a lot of reasonable doubts, and we're going to cover those reasonable doubts in this talk. So John, you've been, doing journalism. You started off in sports a long time ago. And you're from Pennsylvania, around the Philadelphia area. And as you pointed out, you don't really have a connection to Penn State other than being from Pennsylvania, and you went to Georgetown. So what got you interested in this case?
Well, I think that's an important question. Normally, I wouldn't think that the background of the reporter is particularly important. But in this case, I think that it is, because in a weird way, I think I was the perfect and maybe the only person that could have taken this on for the following reasons. I really had the perfect background for tackling this story from the from a contrarian, non-conformist, non-conventional wisdom perspective. And that's because, as you already said, I had a background as a television sportscaster, and I grew up in Pennsylvania, but nowhere near State College in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I was certainly aware of Penn State and Joe Paterno, but I was not a huge fan. I grew up as a Notre Dame fan. As you said, I went to Georgetown University, but I'd also coached high school football in two different states. I'd written a book about a high school football team, as you know, in Steubenville, Ohio. And so I had covered college and pro football for television at an NBC affiliate in Ohio and in a Fox affiliate in Raleigh, North Carolina. I had been a radio talk show host in Philadelphia at legendary WIP radio. And I knew sports. I knew the sports media, but I also knew the news media in general. I'd done a documentary film about the 2008 presidential election called Media Malpractice. I had done media commentary throughout, my entire career. I'd been on the Today Show previously to promote that Media Malpractice documentary. I had been on every major cable news television show. I'd been on The View. I knew these people. I knew their vulnerabilities. I knew that this was a story that was incredibly easy for the mainstream news media to blow because of their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses. And to be clear, I did not go into this story back in November of 2011 thinking or even wanting to believe that Jerry Sandusky was innocent. I presumed he was guilty. My dog in this hunt at first was the Joe Paterno aspect of this, because to me, based upon everything I knew about Joe Paterno, Penn State, college football, humanity, the sports media, the news media, it seemed to me very, very clear that Joe Paterno was being railroaded. The story about Joe Paterno made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And for those that don't remember it, we were being told, based upon nothing more than a grand jury presentment, which is nothing. It's just the prosecution throwing a bunch of stuff against the wall with no defense, no context, no nothing. It's all in a secret process. That we were being told that Joe Paterno had been informed by a graduate assistant coach by the name of Mike McQuiry that McQuiry had witnessed Jerry Sandusky anally raping a young boy in a Penn State shower, and that Joe Paterno basically did nothing but pass it up the food chain, and then Penn State did nothing and allowed, Sandusky to not be reported. But to be clear, at this point, Jerry Sandusky was a former assistant coach at Penn State. And that might be the most important word in this entire story. Former. There's no incentive. There's no motivation. There's no logic at all for Joe Paterno or anyone else at Penn State to be covering up child sex abuse to protect a former coach. That doesn't mean it couldn't theoretically have happened, but there's no motivation for it, and there's no evidence for it. And so I started this whole crusade from the perspective of Jerry Sandusky must be guilty, although I was a little bit skeptical of some of the allegations against him, because even early on, some of it didn't make a lot of sense. But I'm like, okay, I didn't know much about pedophilia or ephebophilia then. I also trusted that there's no way the prosecution could blow a case of this proportion so dramatically. So I was focused on Joe Paterno and an alleged Penn State cover-up. And as I got deeper and deeper and deeper, and I'm talking super deep into the story over the years, many, many years, and in an incredible amount of time put into this investigation, what I realized was that my initial instincts that Joe Paterno was innocent and that there was no Penn State cover-up was in fact true. But the reason why there was no Joe Paterno Penn State cover-up of Jerry Sandusky is that there were no crimes by Jerry Sandusky, and that's the only way, and I mean the only way, to make this entire story make sense. And it's a lot like a very complicated puzzle when you suddenly realize that Jerry Sandusky is innocent and it's not even close. All of a sudden, the very perplexing and contradictory puzzle pieces all of a sudden all fit into place. And this was a case where the news media blew it in a perfect storm, a moral panic. I have related a lot of what happened in this case to what would eventually happen with what I call the COVID panic. The difference is that COVID was real and Jerry Sandusky's sex crimes were not, but it was an incredibly similar dynamic with regard to the way humans react in a panic, the way the news media reacts in a panic when they become invested in a narrative. They don't care about the evidence showing that the original narrative was wrong, especially when they put all their chips down. There were other stories that were like this. Duke Lacrosse is a great example because recently the Duke Lacrosse accuser officially acknowledged that she made the whole story up. That story could be corrected because they didn't put all their chips down. That was a big story, but that was nowhere near as big as Penn State, Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky. Nobody went to prison, in the Duke Lacrosse situation. So the reality is, and although there was damage done, there was nowhere near as much damage as was done and is still being done to this day in the Penn State Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky case, where we have 3 administrators that have gone to prison. Jerry Sandusky is very, very likely to die in prison as an innocent man. The Joe Paterno legacy was completely and totally destroyed. We saw that again just this week as Penn State sold the naming rights to their stadium in a ridiculous deal that effectively ends any effort to name the stadium or the field for Joe Paterno, as would have obviously happened had this, what I believe to be fake scandal, never occurred. And so, my evolution, my background and my evolution on this story, I think is important for people to understand the context of what really happened here and where I'm coming from. I've not made any money, and I tried to make any money. In fact, I've avoided making any money on this story. I've lost money on this story. I've lost enormous amounts of career opportunities. I'm not doing this because I'm a Penn State fan. In fact, I loathe Penn State more than any other sporting institution. I root against Penn State football. I root against Penn State in everything now. I didn't always feel that way, but because of their handling of this situation, I despise Penn State. And I make no bones about that. If I was trying to make money, I would not be telling Penn Staters how much I hate their school and their athletic program, and frankly, many of them, because everything about this case, Chris, is upside down. And one of the things that is upside down is that you would think that it would be Penn State football fans that would be most likely to jump on this bandwagon because they want to defend their program. They want to defend Joe Paterno. And therefore, in the minds of casual observers, they think, oh, the people that believe Jerry Sandusky is innocent, they're just crazy Penn State fans. That is not only not true, it's the opposite of true. Penn Staters are the very worst audience for the truth of the story. And the reason is, it's going back to COVID, it's a lot like convincing mask wearers during COVID that masks don't work, or people that have gotten their 5th booster shot for the vaccine, that the vaccine was not necessary in most cases. Those people are too deeply invested in a particular narrative. They don't want to admit that they were duped. As has been said many times, it is far easier to dupe somebody than to convince them that they have been duped. And so because Penn Staters are so invested in this horrific narrative, they suffered so much. They don't want to now go back and go, you mean I suffered all that for nothing? You mean I now have to acknowledge that I threw 5 of our best guys, Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier and Tim Curley and Gary Schultz and Jerry Sandusky, under the bus with no evidence in a moral panic? No one wants to, or very few people have the courage to do that. And so Penn Staters are actually the worst people on this case. The people that have listened to our podcast and have been convinced in extremely high percentages are generally not Penn Staters. People that don't have any connection to Penn State. Our podcast, by the way, is with the benefit of hindsight. It's an epic podcast. Everyone who's ever been, that I'm aware of, that's ever been hooked on it, becomes completely convinced that I am right. It's co-hosted by Liz Habib, who ironically enough was my news anchor when I was a sports anchor in Steubenville, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia at the NBC affiliate there. She was is a Pitt graduate, has no love for Penn State. She totally had bought into the conventional wisdom narrative, and now is as convinced as I am that Jerry Sandusky is not only innocent, but it's not even close. And I think that's the most important part of this. It's not even close. Anyone that looks at this objectively goes, holy crap, I can't believe we fell for this, especially given what we now know, because so many things have happened in the last 14 years, including COVID, including Duke lacrosse, including other stories that have eventually been blown up that didn't really happen, that are somewhat similar. Jussie Smollett. I mean, we've seen time and time again that the news media is very vulnerable for falling for scams and hoaxes and false narratives. And that's what happened here. And it's not close.
Yes, John, the one question that's always been on my mind, if I was seeing something like that happen, I go to the police immediately. I don't go to my boss. So why didn't McQuiry just call the police immediately?
Well, Chris, you have put your finger on what I think is one of the more interesting points and one of the more fascinating ways that people reacted to this. And I still see this to this day occasionally when people still reference this case. The only part of this narrative that the news media was even a little bit skeptical about was the story we're being told is that Mike McQuiry, then a graduate assistant, 6'3", 4", whatever, 235 pounds, whatever he was, in his late 20s, in tremendous physical shape, former quarterback at Penn State. He walks in on an old man raping a young boy. He claimed to have been 10 years old, but that was not true. The boy was actually 13 years old at the time. And then the boy is getting anally raped. And what does McQuiry do? He does nothing. He doesn't stop Sandusky. He doesn't get the boy out of a very obviously dangerous situation. He just leaves, and then he calls his dad, allegedly. Now, it's important to point out, Chris, and this seems like a very small point, but there's never been any phone records produced to show that he called his dad that night. And I believe the reason why there's no phone records to show that he called his dad that night is because they got the date wrong. And that's why they can't produce phone records. Because this date, the date of this incident, in fact, the first episode of our podcast with the benefit of hindsight is called The Date, because I think the date of that situation is extremely important, which I'm going to get to momentarily. But back to your point. So we're to believe that Mike McQuiry, that just think about this logically, is Mike McQuiry's own acknowledged lack of action, is that more consistent with the narrative of a boy being raped, or is that more consistent with my theory, which is that this was a very odd situation, troubling situation? I have no problem with McQuiry being uncomfortable with it or wanting to ask questions. What the hell is Jerry Sandusky doing in a shower alone with a boy? By the way, it's important to point out, and you, I'm sure, know this, Chris.
Yes.
The definition of shower, I think, threw a lot of people off in this case.
Yes.
People who are, athletic, have played sports, they've been involved in especially the college football environment. They know that this shower is a huge area. Huge area.
Yes.
These are not individual showers where someone would be potentially trapped in a shower.
Exactly.
These are huge areas. It's frankly the worst place you would ever try to trap somebody if that was your goal, to do something like this. By the way, it's interesting to me, and it took me years to think about this, but we now have all this information of all the accusers of Jerry Sandusky, both those at trial and those that got a boatload of money from Penn State. Not one of them, Chris, not one of them ever made an allegation that Jerry Sandusky tried to rape them in his own shower at home.
Yes.
And the reason why that's so important is if this was an obsession with Jerry Sandusky, he had these kids at his home all the time, there would at least be somebody who said, yeah, Jerry tried to get me to take a shower, did force me to take a shower. And because that would be a situation where a kid would be far more vulnerable just from a spatial perspective. But that never happened because Jerry understood that would be absurd and that would be completely inappropriate and wrong. He grew up in a rec home that was not unlike the shower situation at Penn State, where everyone showered naked. It was not a big deal. This was, by the way, there was testimony at Jerry's trial from many other people saying this was not unusual to see kids showering in the Penn State showers, that this was just normal. Nudity was not a big deal.
Yes.
And so I do think you have to understand that these allegations, allegedly this particular situation allegedly occurred in 2001, although I believe it happened at the very end of 2000. And that is long before, for instance, the Catholic Church pedophilia scandal, which I think changed everyone's perspective on what is possible and what people's motivations are. This is Happy Valley, Pennsylvania, that's literally what it was called. I mean, this is a very naive time period. This is basically the 1950s, even though it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. That's what it was culturally. And so back to your original question, I think McQuiry saw something that was making him uncomfortable. And I've used the what I call the Loch Ness Monster metaphor for what really happened here. Here's what I believe really happened with Mike McQuiry. I think that he was visiting the Loch Ness, and he saw a ripple in the water, or he saw a head poking out of the water that he found to be odd, weird. He remembered it. He asked people about it. Hey, have you ever seen anything in the loch? I'm using the analogy here of what he saw in the shower. And then 10 years later, this is so important, the time lapse here, 10 years later, authorities come to him under very, very stressful circumstances for McQuiry, where he thought they were coming to see him about a Penn State phone that he was using to send pictures of his penis to a woman, not his wife. They come to him and they basically say, hey, we hear you saw something in the lock. We believe there's a monster in that lock. We think you saw the monster. Can you tell us what you saw? Well, 10 years later, McQuiry is going to try to help them, and he's going to automatically think, oh my God, that weird thing I saw, that ripple in the water, the head I saw poking out, that must have been the monster being Jerry Sandusky. And so he amplifies his story. The prosecutors further amplify that story and exaggerate it and basically lie about what McQuiry was willing to testify to in that grand jury presentment. By the way, it should be pointed out that when it finally went to trial on that allegation, the jury acquitted Jerry Sandusky on the rape charge because McQuiry himself had said he never saw that. And so we have a guy who acknowledges under oath that he never saw a rape. The jury acquitted him on that. The date was wrong, I believe, not once, but twice. I believe they got the date, the month, and the year wrong, not once, but twice. And I believe I have proven it in the podcast. And so and it's important that people understand the entire case hinges on McQuiry's story. All of it. All of the cover-up and the case against Sandusky crumbles to the ground instantaneously like a house of cards if you don't have McQuiry, because McQuiry is the only non-accuser witness in the entire case, and the investigation was about to be dropped before they found Mike McQuiry. There's all sorts of evidence that they were about to go, you know what, we've looked at this for 2 years, and we can't find anything to back up this original allegation by Aaron Fisher. We don't believe this kid. He can't testify to the grand jury. He's tried twice. It hasn't worked out. He finally had to read his testimony with his therapist sitting right next to him. He's not a credible person. And so we're just going to drop this thing. And then under incredibly bizarre circumstances, they find Mike McQuiry. They manipulate his story. And once it becomes reported, and McQuiry himself immediately complained to the prosecutor. We have an email. McQuiry complaining about how his story is being portrayed in the media because it's not accurate. And the prosecutor basically tells him, you know what, shut up. We can't say anything right now about this. And there's a mountain of evidence, which we have documented and with the benefit of hindsight, that the McQuiry story is not to be believed, and it's not reasonable doubt, because I believe I have filled in all the blanks to provide an alternative narrative that makes way more sense, that explains your question. Why didn't McQuiry react more strongly? He didn't react more strongly because all he saw or heard, in his own words, heard, was Jerry Sandusky, having horseplay with a boy in a shower, something he shouldn't have been doing. It was stupid for him to be doing. But in the context of 2000 or 2001, and given the context of the relationship that Jerry had with that particular boy, a guy by the name of Alan Myers, who he considered to be his own son, it's much more understandable. And it's also 100% inconsistent with the idea that this was a sexual crime. And that, once you accept that there is, at the very least, grave doubt about the McQuiry story, you can look at the rest of this case with much clearer eyes, instead of everyone saw this case through the prism of, oh my God, we've accepted that Jerry Sandusky raped the boy in a shower because Mike McQuiry had no reason to lie. Actually, the McQuiry story makes a hell of a lot more sense under my scenario, under my theory, than under the prosecution's. And I've only really touched on the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, as you pointed out, this was maybe a big room with a dozen shower heads. So you might have 12 people taking showers together. It's like your high school gym locker room or something like that. Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's male only, but it's definitely not a private space. So it's not really a place where you'd want to, it really isn't a place where you'd try anything.
Well, just to interrupt you there for a second, to buy this story in its totality, you have to believe that Jerry Sandusky was a criminal mastermind. Okay. And it is absolutely imbecilic that that's where you're going to commit rapes with young men in a semi-public place where anyone can walk in on you at a moment's notice. Whereas you said, it's this rather large area. I mean, the mind boggles as to how stupid this would have to be. And by the way, if you were that reckless, this is maybe the most important point. If you were that reckless, Chris, you couldn't have gotten away with this for 40 some years. Yeah, there's just no possible way, especially in that high profile a position. You could never have gotten away with this for that long.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Sandusky was the defensive coordinator up until 1999, but then after that he retired. So,
Right.
so what is wrong? What are the other things that are wrong with the whole Mike McQuiry story? You've talked about the date, for example, and this is probably the most interesting part of it.
Yeah, to me, this is both my best work on this case and my worst work on this case is the date. I feel an enormous amount of guilt and regret over my handling of the date situation, but I believe it's the most important revelation. So when this story first began, we were told through the grand jury presentment that this event, this rape, occurred on March 1st of 2002. And so, like everyone else, I accepted that they must have some evidence as to why it was March 1st, 2002. And the prosecution was very, very proud of that date because March 1st, 2002 was the first day of spring break. That night was the first, spring break was starting at Penn State on that Friday night. And to them, this made a lot of sense because this explained why Jerry Sandusky felt like he had an expectation of privacy, right? In the Penn State lockers. It's not football season. It's beginning of March. It's spring break. So this would explain in their minds why Jerry Sandusky felt like he could get away with raping a boy in a semi-private area. But then something absolutely remarkable happened. And this was the first time in this entire case where I started to get like chills and the hair on my arms standing up because I'm like, holy shit, what is going on here? It was just a few months after the story broke, and it was before Jerry Sandusky's trial. This was after Joe Paterno had passed away. So Joe Paterno died not even knowing what the real date was of the event that ended his career and destroyed his legacy. The prosecution put out a statement saying, yeah, remember that March 1st, 2002 date? Yeah. Ugh. Turns out that was wrong. And we know that it was wrong because we found some emails that indicate when McQuiry went to go see Joe Paterno. And it wasn't March 2nd, the morning of March 2nd, after the witnessing of an alleged rape on the evening of March 1st. It was actually on February 10th of 2001. So they get the date, the month, and the year of this episode totally wrong. And I'm like, whoa, what is going on here? We're going to place this entire case on a witness who got the date, the month, and the year wrong? Now, just from a reasonable doubt perspective, Chris, that's incredibly problematic, right? Incredibly problematic because your credibility is shot. This is all about you remembering something that happened up to 10 years earlier, and you can't get the date, the month, and the year wrong, right? And I want to put an exclamation point on this incredibly significant element of the story. This isn't a situation where they woke Mike McQuiry up in the middle of the night and said, "What's the date that you witnessed this?" This was after months and months of the prosecution and McQuiry, trying to research this, try to put together a timeline because they know the timeline's incredibly important here. The date is everything to an allegation that happened years and years prior. So this was after the prosecution put everything they could into this, and they bought into the March 1st date, I believe, because it was a quiet night on campus, as Mike McQuiry allegedly, not allegedly, he did testify to that, allegedly being the case, that this was super quiet. And on March 1st, of 2002, first night of spring break, it would have been very quiet on campus, okay? But here's the problem. There's a huge amount of problems, but this is the biggest one. So because they now have these emails, and it's important to point out, where did they get the emails from? They never told you this. They got the emails voluntarily from Gary Schultz, one of the administrators who would eventually go to jail in this. He found these emails and voluntarily provided them. Okay? That to me blows up a huge portion of the cover-up theory. But so Gary Schultz provides these emails, and we now know that this event had to have occurred. The earliest, the latest that could have occurred would have been the evening of February 9th of 2001, because we know McQuiry goes to see Paterno on the morning Saturday of February 10th. Well, there's a massive problem, and this is where I screwed up. Because the first time I interviewed Jerry Sandusky in prison for well over 3 hours, and I was presuming he was guilty at the time, and I was presuming everything he told me was a lie, because I didn't trust anything at that time. I'm just looking at this from the perspective of Penn State and Joe Paterno not having covered up his crimes. There was one thing, Chris, I was more positive about than anything else in that entire interview, and that was Jerry Sandusky did not believe that the second McQuiry date was correct. He was positive of it. As I've said many times, he knew in his bones that that date made no sense. And part of the reason why he knew that date made no sense is that he knew who the boy, the identity of the boy he was with the night of the so-called McQuiry episode. And he knew in general what the narrative of that day was. And that day was that they had spent the whole day together. They had driven across the state of Pennsylvania together, and they had worked out. And when they got back to Penn State, and they took a shower. And he knew that boy, guy by the name of Alan Myers, would not have had school that day, because Jerry said he would never have taken Alan out of school for an entire day. He would never have done that. And so I did a cursory check, because after I did the interview, I made an agreement with the Today Show to do an interview with Matt Lauer. It got delayed, I think, because of the Pope dying, but I had a limited amount of time, and I should have gone down this path. That's, in retrospect, it's one of the biggest mistakes I ever made. I should have been able to go on the Today Show and declare the date is wrong, and everyone needs to look at that. But when I did this cursory investigation, I called Alan Myers' school. I got an old calendar, and sure enough, they had school that day. And so I'm like, okay, that's odd. And I started to think, is it possible that Jerry has concocted this entire Alan Myers narrative to try to fool me, or who knows, right? I'm still thinking I'm dealing with a criminal mastermind here, when I would eventually find out I'm dealing with a doofus who's incredibly naive and not capable of any of this, because he's very smart in some ways, but very, very dumb in others. And so I eventually go back to re-examine that date of February 9th, 2001, something I should have done immediately. And it would have been easy to figure out, because someone else did this. And then I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe that I blew this. But what we learn is that February 9th of 2001 is not only not a quiet night on Penn State's campus, that area of campus where this event occurred, the Lash building, was as busy as it would be the entire year of 2001. There was a sold-out rock concert going on right across the street. Gary Schultz told me on that basis alone, Mike McQuiry could never have even found parking at the Lash building. And yet he's describing this as a very quiet night on campus. At the Lash building that night, Penn State has a very, very established hockey program now, but back then they did not. Their hockey program played their games in that building. They had a hockey game that night in the very building where this event occurred, that it started almost exactly at the same time that this event allegedly occurred. There is no possible way that Mike McQuiry would have ever described this night as a very quiet night on campus. It was exactly the opposite. And so it did not happen on February 9th of 2001. And so I then went back to Jerry and I put some other pieces together and I got some help from some other people. And what I now very strongly believe, and what Jerry Sandusky believes, and what his wife Dottie Sandusky believes, and what Graham Spanier, the former president of the university, believes, what Gary Schultz believes, we all now believe that the actual date of this event was December 29th of the year 2000, which was also a Friday, and which would have absolutely been an extremely quiet night on campus. There's no more quiet night on a Penn State campus than a Friday in between Christmas and New Year's. There is nobody there. That would fit 100% with McQuiry's recollection and testimony of this. And you might be saying, well, John, what evidence do you have? I have a lot of evidence, including from prosecution witnesses, that is far more consistent with the December 29, 2000 date than I do than the prosecution has. That's for sure, including the two men that McQuiry allegedly spoke to the night of this incident, his dad and a guy by the name of Dr. Dranoff. Both of them, and this gets complicated, and you can go to the podcast if you're interested in the details, but you're just going to have to trust me in the streamlined version of this. They both testified that there was at least a couple of months or 2 to 3 months between the time of this event and when they had a meeting with Gary Schultz where they asked for a follow-up on Jerry Sandusky. 2 to 3 months. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what they said. Both of them under oath. Well, if you backtrack from when Gary Schultz says that meeting, the only dates that meeting could have occurred in late February of that year, if you subtract 2 months from late February, where are you? You're in late December. So my date is far more consistent with the prosecution's own witnesses than their story is, because their story is, because under the prosecution's version of events, there's maybe not even 2 weeks from the time of when McQuiry comes to them and tells them this story and when they have that meeting with Gary Schultz. And I'm sorry for both of them to independently testify under oath that there was an extended period of time from when McQuiry came to them and said, I saw this thing, which, by the way, Dr. Dranoff asked him 3 times, did you see a sexual event? And 3 times Michael Curry said no. And that's incredibly important. I believe very strongly that the December 29th date is the only date that makes sense, because it's on that day that Jerry Sandusky drove from Washington, Pennsylvania, where he had a book signing for his book that was just coming out, and drove to State College, Pennsylvania. It's a Friday during Christmas vacation. Alan Myers has no school. I have a witness who Jerry Sandusky called while he was stopping for gas, that had a very good reason for Jerry Sandusky to call him that night, because he was up for the Virginia head coaching job. And this guy was Jerry Sandusky's college roommate. And his son went to the University of Virginia. So he was intensely interested in whether or not Jerry was going to take or get the Virginia head coaching job. I've spoken to this guy extensively. He had no idea why I was calling. I called him basically cold, and he's a very straightforward, old school guy. He had all the details. He knew, he was, in my mind, incredibly credible. And so we have 2 situations that Jerry Sandusky had told me in that first interview, when he didn't know what the date was, but he was positive it was not February 9th, 2001. He said to me, I've associated that event with my book coming out and with me not getting the head coaching job at the University of Virginia. And sure enough, when you go back and you look at paper clippings, those 2 things converge on that weekend of December 29th December 30th. There's an article in the local newspaper where Jerry Sandusky, on the morning of December 30th, finds out while watching television that Al Groh, a former a Virginia alum who was coaching the New York Jets at the time, ends up getting the head coaching job at the University of Virginia, a job that Jerry Sandusky had been offered. And by the way, I'm sure as a sports guy, you probably found this part to be interesting. You know, I am convinced that because Jerry Sandusky told me, without me provoking him at all, a story of that process of him interviewing multiple times, like 4 times for the Virginia head coaching job. And the last time he was interviewed, he had a contract presented to him, but he felt something weird was going on. Like the temperature of the room had changed. Someone went to go take a phone call and he could tell that the temperature had changed, that they were no longer as enthusiastic. Well, putting all these pieces together, it's very obvious what happened, because this was only like a couple of days before Al Groh ends up getting or taking the job. Al Groh had been the head football coach of the New York Jets. They were expected to make the playoffs that year. They lost their last 3 games in a collapse. Al Groh got in a fight with a reporter. Al Groh knew he was going to get fired. And he's a Virginia alum. He was actually part of the search committee that was going to give Jerry Sandusky this incredibly important job as the head football coach at Virginia. And I believe that phone call that the administrator from Virginia got was Al Groh saying, hold everything. Don't give Sandusky the job. I want the gig. And sure enough, as a Virginia alum, just a couple days later, they give it to Al Groh. It had nothing to do with any sort of suspicion about Jerry Sandusky. It was about Al Groh realizing he was about to get fired as the head coach of the New York Jets and wanting to land at his alma mater. And one of the great ironies, there's so many amazing elements of this whole story, is that the only reason anyone cares about the Jerry Sandusky story from a sports perspective is that it was Jerry Sandusky's defense that in the 1986 Fiesta Bowl, the most highly rated college football game of all time against Miami, Penn State and Miami, it was Sandusky's defense that intercepted Miami's Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, Vinny Testaverde, 5 times. That's the whole reason why the sports world gave a damn about Jerry Sandusky. So here he makes his fame, he makes his, the whole reason why anyone cares about the story is his defense intercepts Vinny Testaverde 5 times. And now we have Al Groh getting on the verge of being fired because of a collapse of the New York Jets during that 2000 season. And who was their quarterback, Chris? Vinny Testaverde. So I call it the revenge of Vinny Testaverde in both directions. If Vinny Testaverde had thrown 5 touchdowns instead of 5 interceptions, we never hear about Jerry Sandusky. No one gives a fuck about this story. Or if Vinny Testaverde doesn't lead the Jets' collapse in 2000, Al Groh doesn't take the Virginia job, Jerry Sandusky's the head coach at Virginia, and we never hear anything about this story because it never happens. And
so.
100% so. So this whole case really comes down to Vinny Testaverde.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
Well, yeah. So why did Mike McQuiry want to meet with Joe Paterno in February of 2001?
Well, that's a great question, which unfortunately even Malcolm Gladwell, the very famous author who has written about this whole date situation using my research in a book called Talking to Strangers, chapter number 5, Malcolm does a really good job, except he leaves out McQuiry's motivation for why he goes to see Joe Paterno, which I'm assuming you're implying. And that is, we are now sure, because of the circumstances that night on campus of February 9, 2001, that Mike McQuiry did not witness any sort of episode with Jerry Sandusky with a boy in a shower. But here's what Mike McQuiry did find out on February 9th of 2001. He found out that Kenny Jackson, the wide receivers coach for the Penn State Nittany Lions, was leaving to go coach the Pittsburgh Steelers, leaving open the wide receivers coaching position, a position he desperately needed and very, very much wanted as a former quarterback. at Penn State who was at that time a graduate assistant. Now, you do the math, Chris. It's Mike McQuiry finding out on February 9th that the job he once just opened up. He goes to see Joe Paterno on the morning of February 10th. Gee, I wonder if that might have been an instigating event as to why McQuiry would want to go get FaceTime with Joe Paterno. And by the way, there's so many incredibly strange elements of this case. But one of the things that McQuiry testifies to, and I believe this might have been one of the things that Mike testified to after Paterno was dead. I can't remember for sure. But Mike's testimony expands greatly after Paterno was dead, and Paterno can no longer contradict anything that he says. But McQuiry at some point testifies that when he called Joe Paterno that morning to see whether or not he could come over to talk to him, Paterno says to him, allegedly, if this is about a job, don't bother coming over. I don't have one for you. Now, I found that statement to be fascinating, and it always stuck in my brain, but I didn't know how to interpret it until I was actually in the Paterno home. I was sitting at the very same table where allegedly, although I don't believe this actually happened, or allegedly McQuiry and Paterno had this conversation in the Paterno family kitchen. And a whole bunch of family members, Paterno family members are there, supporters are there. Sue Paterno is off to the side. I believe she was getting some peachy Paterno ice cream out of the freezer. And I referenced that statement of Mike claiming that Joe Paterno said that morning to Mike, if this is about a job, don't bother. I don't have one for you. Something to that very strong effect. And Sue Paterno spins around, and I had almost no contact with Sue during this meeting before this. She spins around and screams at me. That's not an exaggeration. She screams at me, that never happened. And I was like, whoa, okay, whoa. I know enough about old married couples that if a wife who has been married that long to a guy says something like that didn't happen, I put a lot of weight on that. And this was a woman who was there that day, has a legendary memory, and says emphatically that didn't happen. Now, doesn't prove that didn't happen, but I already had suspicions about that statement, because what I think is happening with that testimony from McQuiry, that is McQuiry's subconscious trying to cut off at the pass the real explanation for why he was going to go see Joe Paterno. If you follow me here, that he's preemptively, he knows it was about a job, but he's creating, maybe he's conniving enough to do this consciously, but I'm actually giving him some credit that this is subconscious. For whether it's conscious or subconscious, he's creating a cover story for anyone who might claim, oh, by the way, isn't it weird that the Kenny Jackson job just happened to open up that morning? And oh, by the way, McQuiry does not get the job at that time, which I've always believed I thought this from day one that we heard this story. There's no way that there's a cover-up. That story alone destroys the cover-up theory, because if this is a cover-up, Mike McQuiry is the lone witness, the lone fly in the ointment to this cover-up. And he's a graduate assistant. He's making no money. I don't even think he has health insurance. He's basically a slave. He's a glorified intern, okay? You have a job that he is qualified for that just happens to open up. It is cover-up 101 that you're going to say, you know what, Mike, thanks so much for bringing this to us. We really appreciate it. By the way, you've been doing a great job. And you probably heard, I don't know if you did, but Kenny Jackson just left to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was in the paper yesterday. And so we would love for you to be our new wide receivers coach. You good with that? That's the way this would go down. And oh, by the way, we're going to keep all this thing with Sandusky between us, right, Mike? And Mike goes, sure, coach, no problem. That's a cover-up. But that's not what happened. McQuiry is left flapping in the breeze. He doesn't have a full-time job. By the way, that job reopens 3 years later. And guess who gets it? Mike McQuiry, which proves that this was a job that Mike both wanted and was plausibly qualified for, but Paterno just wasn't ready to give it to him yet, just, for whatever reason. And so to me, the Kenny Jackson job situation, which unfortunately Malcolm Gladwell omitted from his chapter 5 in Talking to Strangers, is integral to understanding the real Mike McQuiry story. He did not go primarily to Joe Paterno's house to tell him about having witnessed a rape with a young boy in Jerry Sandusky. I'm sure that he mentioned Sandusky. By the way, we have an email from Sue Paterno saying that alleged meeting, you want to call it a meeting, lasted only 3 minutes. Those are her words, 3 minutes, which is an interesting, number to use. Not 5, not 10, 3 minutes. In other words, incredibly short. Who knows if it was exactly 3 minutes, but she was there that day. She says it was a 3-minute meeting, ironically, after Joe Paterno was coming out of the shower because he was going to an event to get an award that night in Pittsburgh. So why is that important? It is absolutely impossible for Mike McQuiry to tell Joe Paterno that he witnessed Jerry Sandusky raping a boy in a shower in anything close to 3 minutes. That is not possible. What you might have happen is Mike comes hoping to get some FaceTime with the coach because he wants the Kenny Jackson job, realizes immediately that ain't happening. Maybe Joe doesn't even ask him to come in and sit down. He gets a cold shoulder there. And then as a cover story or a face-saving maneuver, he references, hey, coach, and this is my theory, but this to me makes the most sense. I don't even know that Mike McQuiry told Joe that it happened last night, because remember, under my theory, it happened basically almost 2 months prior to this, or 6 weeks. It happened 6 weeks prior to this. I think Joe just must have misunderstood or just assumed that if this episode that he witnessed with Jerry horsing around with a boy in a shower, that it must have happened the night before, because why would Mike wait 6 weeks to tell me about it? And so what I think happens is Mike gets the cold shoulder and says, hey, coach, by the way, I've been meaning to tell you, I saw Jerry Sandusky in our shower with a boy. It made me uncomfortable. Can you tell him to knock it off? And coach says, absolutely, I get it. I'll take care of this, Mike. Thanks for coming over. That's a 3-minute conversation. And that, by the way, is consistent with what Joe Paterno did the rest of that weekend. He did exactly the right thing. And so I am convinced that the Kenny Jackson job, the timeline lapse, the 6-week wait. By the way, there's another reason why Mike McQuiry may have waited 6 weeks to go to see Joe Paterno. It wasn't just about the fact that the Kenny Jackson job motivated him to go see Joe Paterno. You have to remember, Mike's number one priority in life is to get a job. And I am sure that he was aware that Jerry Sandusky was up for the Virginia head coaching position. Well, he and Jerry had a good working relationship at this time. If Jerry is about to be a head coach, theoretically, somewhere else, he's not going to cause a problem between him and Jerry by reporting this somewhat innocuous episode with a boy. But by February 9th, coaching, especially back then, the coaching timeline was different. Coaches get hired and fired in the middle of the season now. They don't even coach their bowl games. But back then, certainly by February 9th, coaching hiring season was over. Jerry was not going to get a head coaching job. Certainly not in that cycle. And once you're retired more than 2 years, you're probably not ever going to get another head coaching position. So the dynamics from Mike's political perspective had changed. And I think that may have played a significant role here. By the way, there's one other part of this story as a football fan, Chris, I think you'll appreciate. And this is why one of the reasons why I'm positive that this event did not happen on February 9th. And that is because on February 7th of 2001, it was National Signing Day in college football. And back then, as you well know, National Signing Day was a huge deal. It's much more diluted now. It basically doesn't even exist. Commitments mean nothing. But back then, that was like Christmas Day for assistant coaches. And Mike's job was on the line because he was recruiting. And, February 7th was a massive day, not just for the sport, but for him in particular. Now, I want you to imagine if this event had really happened on February 9th of 2001. If it had really happened that way, as he was going through his memory, he would have pegged it as having been 2 days after or in the close vicinity of National Signing Day, because that would have made a mark in his memory. By the way, speaking of his memory, one of the first things that always bothered me was Mike goes from saying that this event happened, this allegedly witnessing the rape of a young boy, which is a catastrophic circumstance you will never forget, right? It's a life-changing situation, especially when it's Jerry Sandusky who is the perpetrator. Mike goes from believing that this happened the year after 9/11 to believing that it happened before 9/11. And I'm sorry, Chris, but in my memory and in most people I know who are living through that time period, you marked time by before and after 9/11. And for him to go from thinking that this happened after 9/11 to before 9/11 never made any sense to me. And was one of the many things that made me question his credibility. And that I cannot emphasize enough. If I'm right about the timeline, which I believe I am, the entire case falls apart because none of these other accusers are credible without Mike McQuiry being credible himself.
Is Sue Paterno still alive?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a. So what other holes are there in this case? I don't think we have that much time left.
Well,
unfortunately, I'd like to cover more, but you never know.
Well, I keep making the argument that if you don't believe McQuiry, none of this is believable. But every single one of these accusers of Jerry Sandusky's has massive problems. And so-called victim number one was a kid by the name of Aaron Fisher. And I am a big believer that the first accuser must be rock solid in a situation like this, because if they're not, you can have a very easily understood circumstance where there becomes a blood in the water situation where other people with the help of lawyers and therapists start to see that there's money involved in this situation and they can gravitate, they can be convinced to take part in it. And so if they're all being persuaded by that first allegation that puts blood in the water from a prosecutorial perspective, that's a very dangerous situation. And to me, Aaron Fisher is not remotely credible, not even close. And the prosecution, as I've already suggested, had their own doubts about him because he couldn't even tell his story, literally couldn't answer questions in the grand jury. And I believe that his mother helped facilitate the situation. I believe his therapist helped facilitate a situation. His therapist is a complete quack. He lost his state contract because of his actions in this case. He wrote a book about this, or with Aaron and his mother, which is completely unprofessional and inappropriate and unethical. A lot of things he wrote in the book are absolutely crazy. Chris, in fact, I mentioned I have so many regrets about how I handled this case. One of my biggest mistakes was not reading the Aaron Fisher book, Silent No More, sooner. Reading Aaron Fisher's book, this is not an exaggeration. Reading Aaron Fisher's book, co-written by his mom and his therapist, and with a ghostwriter, reading that book convinced me that Jerry Sandusky was innocent. That's how absurd the book is, how lacking in credibility it is, how contradictory it is. And frankly, if you understand that Jerry is innocent and you read the book through that prism, it all makes a lot more sense than the story that they told. And I did an interview, a very extensive interview with Aaron Fisher's neighbor. And when I say neighbor, I'm talking about neighbor. This was low-income state housing. They're separated by basically a wafer-thin wall. They're essentially living in the same apartment.
Everybody knows everybody's business.
Right. Everybody knows everybody. And this guy, who had absolutely no motivation to lie, told me in extensive detail what he believes, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, was the initial time when Aaron Fisher made somewhat of an allegation against Jerry Sandusky. And in incredible detail, he explains in a way that is making it very obvious that Aaron Fisher was not claiming to his mom that he was sexually abused. This, by the way, Aaron Fisher is a teenage boy at this time. He's a teenage boy who, by his own admission or claims, is having sex with lots of girls. Okay. And so he's not claiming to his mom that he was sexually abused by Jerry Sandusky. He's trying to come up with an excuse for not having to spend the evening with Jerry Sandusky, who was babysitting him. And the mom doesn't want to let him out of that because she wants to go out drinking. And so you got the mom wanting to go out drinking, which she did on a constant basis. She thinks she's got her son taken care of that night because Jerry Sandusky, as he often did, is babysitting him along with another kid, which Aaron has outgrown. Aaron's looking to get girls at this point. And he comes up with this story, which the neighbor witnesses, where he tells the mom, Jerry makes me feel uncomfortable. And that then evolves into the mom deciding that she can make money. She literally says to the neighbor immediately after hearing this story about Jerry Sandusky, I'm going to own that motherfucker's house. That's a quote. She's immediately thinking money. And by the way, does she go to the police? No. Like Mike McQuiry, she doesn't go to the police. Mike McQuiry goes to Joe Paterno because he wants a job. She goes to the school district because she sees that as the source of deep pockets here. It's interesting and important to point out, they don't even view Jerry Sandusky as a Penn State entity because he's so far gone from being a Penn State coach. They see him as the head of a goofy head of a charity called the Second Mile. He doesn't even drive a nice car. They're looking for deep pockets. So because he was an volunteer assistant football coach for the high school football team, people think that somehow he convinced Aaron Fisher to allow himself to be sexually abused because Jerry Sandusky was some sort of a god. He was the opposite of a god. He was a former assistant college football coach who was a volunteer assistant in high school who drove a crappy car and who ran a charity that Aaron had no knowledge of. And so they go to the school, and the school district does not believe Aaron. And they were right not to believe Aaron. They get a lot of criticism now. By the way, one of the people who did not believe Aaron was the football coach at the time. That football coach, just to show you how crazy the story is, Chris. So we're supposed to believe that the school was part of the Jerry Sandusky cover-up, right? So this football coach eventually becomes principal of the school. It doesn't hurt his career at all. Not only does he become principal of the school, he's in the school's Hall of Fame. Now, how does that make any sense if anyone at that school believes that he was enabling or covering up for Jerry Sandusky? It doesn't, because it didn't happen. And I've met with that coach in person, and I know I would go to my death knowing that coach is 100% convinced that Jerry Sandusky was innocent, that Aaron Fisher was lying. And if you don't believe Aaron Fisher, and there's a ton of reasons not to, then everybody else in this story is complete crap because they're simply being motivated to come forward because there's this investigation that was facilitated by Aaron Fisher where they've got therapists and lawyers telling them, you know what? Are you sure this didn't happen to you? Because this could be good for you. They see where this is going. Now, they probably didn't realize how incredibly financially beneficial this would be, especially for, one of the kids who ended up, men, not a kid. No, there were no kids. People need to understand there were no kids who testified against Jerry Sandusky. Everybody was an adult. They did not all come forward at the same time. This was a one-by-one situation where they all had to be persuaded to do so. It took time for all of them to figure out where this could go for them. They all dramatically changed their stories. They all maintained healthy relationship with Jerry Sandusky well into adulthood, sometimes to an extreme and absurd degree. And they all got paid millions and millions of dollars. One of them got paid $20 million. Victim number 9, Sebastian Payton, $20 million for a story that wasn't even part of the original indictment and which makes absolutely, positively no sense and is contradicted by all sorts of logic and evidence. And to me is just the height of how insane this whole situation got. This was a perfect storm of bullshit, and there's no truth to it. Jerry Sandusky is very clearly an innocent man. If you listen to our podcast with the benefit of hindsight, you will be convinced of that. And unfortunately, our system is so broken and our media is so broken that he's going to die in prison and as an innocent man, and a lot of other people's reputations and lives have been permanently destroyed. It's the greatest injustice that has not resulted in a direct death that I've ever come across in my entire life. And it's not close.
Well, I think it was the one guy on ESPN who said Joe died of a broken heart.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, it is kind of amazing that he got diagnosed with advanced cancer right after this whole thing broke, and then he died a couple months later. But that his death played a very significant role in all this, because forget the idea that Jerry Sandusky is innocent, which he is. Think about this from a deep due process perspective, just basic due process. Jerry Sandusky goes on trial the late spring, after the November arrest that creates all this nuclear explosion of news coverage, the firing of Joe Paterno, the charging of the Penn State administrators, and the death of Joe Paterno. All that happens in this incredibly short amount of time. And Jerry goes on trial in the same community. So he's not just a pedophile. He's the pedophile who killed Santa Claus for all intents and purposes. And in 7 months, he's supposed to get a fair trial. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous, given just, even if he was guilty as hell, which he's not, that would be a situation that would be a gross violation of due process principles. And it's something that people need to understand to interpret properly the context of that sham trial. I mean, this really was as close to the Salem witch trials as we've had in the modern history of America that I'm aware of.
What is the reaction of the Paterno family to what you've been doing?
They hate me. And the reason why they hate me, and I don't know what Sue thinks of me. I have been given some indication that Sue is softened towards this narrative. But the biggest problem is that Joe Paterno's son, Scott, boy, I think trying to think of him so little that I just screwed up his name. Scott Paterno.
He's got a few sons, right? I mean, he's got.
Right. But no, this is Scott Paterno, who is a loser. He's obese. He's never accomplished anything. He lost a race for Congress, got blown out back when the Paterno name was still gold. He's never accomplished anything in his life. He was born on third base, and he thinks he hit a triple. And this crisis, this scandal, was Scott's one moment to shine. This was his one shining moment. He really thought at the time that he had nailed it, because Scott bought into Sandusky's guilt before anybody else in the family did. And to be clear, Scott had never had a conversation with Jerry Sandusky. He misunderstood the information that he was getting from very bad sources, specifically Davy Jones, a local sports reporter. Both of them totally misunderstood the information that they were getting. I think that Scott believed in McQuiry and McQuiry's story. He put all of his credibility and all his chips on McQuiry having told the truth. And here's the bottom line. If I'm right, which I am, Scott Paterno is the biggest goat in this whole situation, because it was Scott Paterno's strategy to embrace McQuiry, embrace Sandusky's guilt, and try to save Joe by throwing everybody else under the bus. That was not just stupid strategy, because in that kind of a firestorm, once you acknowledge that Jerry Sandusky is guilty, which Scott did on the Paterno family lawn, on television on November 8th, 2011, he said, let's say a prayer for the victims, because regardless of whatever else happened here, a lot of boys were hurt. That's almost a direct quote. So, and this is a time period where Joe Paterno was not being allowed to speak to the media. I think that was a mistake. I think Scott was thinking like a lawyer and not thinking like a strategist, and he should have just had Joe Paterno do an interview with Tom Rinaldi on ESPN and buy some fucking time. I mean, if you brought Tom Rinaldi into the Paterno family house and let Paterno charm him, even though Joe was way past his prime at that point, I think he could have still pulled that off at that moment. Then you buy some time. But I think Scott was so terrified of the idea that Joe might be fired for cause and that the family would therefore lose out on a lot of money, this is my speculation, that he didn't want Joe doing anything that would be a violation of what he was being ordered to do, which was to not speak publicly. Penn State had canceled his press conference that very critical week, which was really the moment where we left the gravitational pull of the rational earth. There was no return from that. So the point here is that Scott Paterno has, first of all, a vendetta against me. That's number one, but that's not the most important part of this. The most important part is Scott is deeply, deeply, deeply invested in his narrative, because if I'm right and he's wrong, he screwed up. He's the reason why his dad got fired. He's the reason why his name is now mud. And he could never accept that, because this was his great moment. He was being praised within the family. And even in Joe Posnanski's book, which was fairly, sympathetic towards Joe Paterno, it's Scott that was the one who was seeing this crisis emerge, and he was ahead of the curve. No, he wasn't ahead of a curve. He was duped into believing something that wasn't true, which caused him to pursue a very devastating and catastrophically wrong strategy. And Scott just does not have the wherewithal, the self-awareness, the intelligence, or the goodness to be able to accept that. He's an asshole. He's not nearly as smart as he thinks he is. And he believes a lot of things that are just false. I know so many things about myself that he believes are true that I know that are not. And that was really part of how I eventually turned against Scott. I was always presuming, it's important to point out, I presumed at the beginning of this that Scott must know something that I don't know. Because he's the only one that has a different opinion, because I was speaking to dozens and dozens of people in this story, and no one believed McQuiry except Scott did. And I'm like, what does he know that I don't know? And then eventually I realized he doesn't know anything I don't know. He just has a very different self-interest than everybody else because of the circumstances I just outlined for you. So the Paterno family has been an incredible disappointment. Jay Paterno, the former assistant football coach at Penn State, in my very strong opinion, because I've spent many hours with Jay in his den or his living room talking about this, Jay Paterno knows Jerry Sandusky was innocent, but he's a coward. He's a coward, and he will never say it publicly. He's said a few things, I think, if you interpret them properly, you will come to the same conclusion that I did, but he will never say it publicly. And, Jay's a liberal. He's very smart, but he's a coward. Scott's the conservative, and he's an asshole, and he's not that bright at all. And it's the dynamic between the two of them that is another part of this perfect storm, and why the Paterno family essentially sold out. I mean, the Paterno family ended up selling out to Penn State for however much money they got, I don't know, but to end all of their legal actions against the university. And it's another part of the reason why the truth will never be fully accepted, not even within the Penn State community. So I have no love for the Paterno family at all.
And who knows what happens if Joe lives a couple more years. I mean, he would have obviously been brought into court, but he was never in court.
Well, I think Joe Paterno's testimony would have been very, very interesting, because I am convinced one of the most absurd parts of the cover-up theory is that I am positive that if the prosecution did not believe that they had Joe Paterno boxed in, and they did a second interview with him just before they arrested Jerry Sandusky, if Joe Paterno had simply said, guys, I don't really remember what McQuiry told me, if he had just said that, I don't believe Jerry Sandusky ever gets arrested. I am very confident of that. What people don't understand is Joe Paterno was a critical witness for the prosecution, and I don't think it was based upon what Joe Paterno actually remembered. I believe Joe Paterno had an extremely failing memory. He was incredibly old at that time. His health was going. He was really not the head coach anymore. I think he was incredibly insecure about his failing memory. And I think he was therefore, I believe that Joe Paterno made the decision. God, I don't remember what Mike told me.
Yeah,
and I trust Mike. He's coached for me, quarterback for me. And so I'm just going to go with what Mike says, because my son, Scott, is telling me I need to back Mike McQuiry. And so that, I think, is what motivated Joe. There's an HBO special involving and starring Al Pacino as Joe Paterno called Paterno. And the basic narrative, as absurd as it is, of that HBO movie is that Joe Paterno forgot that Jerry Sandusky is a pedophile. That's their basic narrative. Now, they may not agree that that's their narrative, but if you watch the movie, that's basically the narrative. Joe Paterno forgot that Jerry Sandusky was a pedophile. I believe it's exactly the opposite. I believe that Joe Paterno forgot that Jerry Sandusky was a doofus who was not a pedophile, and that he was convinced by Scott and by Mike McQuiry that, oh my gosh, I must have forgot. I must have missed something. And so effectively, it's exactly the opposite narrative. Joe Paterno lost the confidence in his memory to be able to say, Jerry's not a pedophile. I never really liked him very much. He's goofy as hell, but he's not a pedophile. Otherwise, there would have been evidence of that. Joe lost the confidence in his own memory to say that. And I think that was proven by Joe Paterno's deathbed wish. People disregard his deathbed wish, which was find the truth of this matter. Well, if he had been involved in a cover-up, why would he not know what the truth was? Why would he be asking people to find the truth? He was baffled himself. And by the way, other people who spoke to him before his death said the same thing, that Paterno was baffled and confused. And so for him on his deathbed to say, find the truth of this matter, is completely inconsistent with a guy who was part of a cover-up or who was in any way, shape, or form confident that Jerry Sandusky was actually guilty. And I think it's another element of the perfect storm. If Paterno had been able to live and been remotely healthy and had testified at that trial, and if he had expressed even a little bit of doubt, I think it would have changed potentially the outcome of that trial, because of how much in high regard Paterno was held by that community.
Yeah, and maybe if he'd retired 5 years earlier, that might have saved his legacy too. It's hard to tell, really.
If Joe Paterno had retired even 2 years earlier, none of this story ever happens. None of it. I don't believe Jerry Sandusky ever gets arrested, but if he does, no one cares about this story. The only reason why the nuclear bomb went off was because Joe Paterno was in jeopardy of being fired right after having become the all-time winningest coach in the history of college football. That is an incredibly integral part to the perfect storm here. He had just broken the record the week before this story broke. And they were playing Nebraska at home on ESPN that Saturday after the story broke. So there was a pressure point. If this happens in February, no one cares. There's no pressure point. It's okay, let's wait and see how this turns out. Let's wait for the trial. But there was no time for a trial because, oh my God, Joe Paterno is going to be coaching on Saturday at home, and it's going to be and then he announces stupidly, Scott does, that this is going to be his last home game, and now it's a celebration of Joe Paterno's career. You can't have a celebration of Joe Paterno's career when he's being accused of covering up for a pedophile on ESPN 24/7. And so that's why the Penn State Board of Trustees fired him. And so anyway, have I convinced you? Have I convinced you, Chris?
Well, I was already pretty convinced, but there was one other thing I wanted to cover. You got a hold of Jerry Sandusky's medical records.
Yes. The medical.
What did you find there?
Well, the medical records are important. I waited for a very long time to disclose the medical records for a variety of reasons. They've now become public because of another report. I'm not particularly thrilled that they've become public, but they are now a matter of public record. And that is that there are two problems about this narrative regarding Jerry Sandusky's medical condition. Number one is that during the time period of some of the most horrendous allegations, Jerry Sandusky had extremely low testosterone. Extremely low. And for a man at his age, that basically makes some of the things that were alleged utterly impossible from a sexual perspective. But that, I think, pales in comparison to the other thing that we found in Jerry Sandusky's medical records. And that is that Jerry Sandusky is described by his doctor, and this is well before there were any allegations against him, as having virtually no testicular matter. That's, I believe, the direct quote in the medical records. Virtually no testicular matter. Now, that raises two incredibly important questions. A guy with low testosterone and no testicles is not anally raping teenage boys who are heterosexual in his basement. That's not happening, okay, from a physical perspective, especially at his age. But I actually think, I focus on a different element of the medical records. And that is that if we are to believe the conventional wisdom of the story, because Penn State paid, I think 36 guys millions of dollars, and there were 8 accusers at trial. So we have dozens of males who allegedly engaged in sexual activity with Jerry Sandusky, right? And not one of them, not one, ever mentioned anything about him having no testicles. Not one. That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible. If it was, we know that Jerry had no testicles effectively. Even if you accept that somehow he was magically able to get instantaneous erections and do, by the way, one of the more interesting, there's so many interesting things, but I have found, and this is more than one person, this is like 3 or 4 people. I have found that the group of people that are most skeptical of this story and who should have been on Jerry Sandusky's jury if his defense knew what the hell they were talking about are gay men. Gay men hear these stories and they're like, this is ridiculous. This is not real life. This is like gay porn written by straight men. And by the way, that's exactly what the stories are. They are gay porn written by straight men, the straight men being the accusers and their lawyers. And so it is impossible for Jerry Sandusky to have no testicles and not one person says, yeah, it was weird. Jerry had like no balls. That would not be possible given the entire narrative of this case for not one person to ever mention this. And to me, that's the smoking gun that the whole case is bullshit.
Well, you also said conservative mothers of teenage boys.
Well, yeah, the two groups that I would put on Jerry's jury, if I had gotten 3 or 4 gay men and 3 or 4 conservative moms who have had teenage boys, Jerry would have been acquitted. In my opinion, based upon my experience having talked to hundreds of people about this case. Those are the two groups that realize, wait a minute, This story doesn't make any sense. Now, the worst people to put on this jury were straight men, because straight men, their heads explode with the allegation. Oh my God. And liberal women are terrible, because liberal women, they think of the allegations as having occurred to them if they were a teenage girl. This is one of the so many problems with this case. All the key players, until we get to trial, all the key players in this prosecution are women. All of them. Every single one. Every person driving this investigation is a woman for all intents and purposes, including Sarah Ganim, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her bogus reporting and whose career has gone nowhere ever since then, which is remarkable. And why that's important is that I believe that these women, I'm not criticizing them for this, I'm just observing, they're looking at these allegations and they're thinking, okay, if I was a 12-year-old girl or a 13-year-old girl or a 14-year-old girl, which is the basic ages where when these allegations occurred, and there was an older man who was sexually abusing me, that would be plausible. Okay? That would be plausible from all sorts of perspectives. The physical strength disparity, the anatomical elements, that would make sense. All right? But that's not what the allegation was here. The allegation was an older man with heterosexual teenage boys. Heterosexual teenage boys who oftentimes are as strong or stronger than Jerry Sandusky would have been, including Aaron Fisher, are not going to put up with sexual abuse unless they're getting paid a lot of money for that. They're not going to do it. They're going to have a fight or flight response to it. And so that to me is one of the many fundamental problems in this whole situation. Women, especially liberal women, look at these allegations through a very jaundiced prism that is not consistent with the allegations. By the way, if one of Jerry's accusers had been openly gay, I think I probably would have dropped the whole case. I would have said, okay, because that would make sense. If you're a criminal mastermind and you're Jerry Sandusky and you have this thing for having sex with young teenage boys, 11, 12, 13, 14, sometimes older than that, boys, according to the allegations, you would not pick straight boys or young men. You would pick gay men. That's the number one. So Jerry Sandusky had the worst gaydar in the history of pedophilia because he didn't find one gay man or gay young boy to engage in this behavior with, which would obviously be, 10,000 times easier to pull off with a gay boy than with a straight boy. By the way, not just straight boys, but straight boys from central Pennsylvania in a time period where homosexuality was looked at basically like rural Alabama. I mean, so yeah, it's an absurd narrative. It's absurd.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, Aaron Fisher was quite the player.
Well, Aaron Fisher, according to
a player is the least likely person to,
Well, Aaron Fisher, at the time of these allegations, was, by his own account, and I don't believe this, but I have interviews with his friends who tell a very consistent story, that he's having sex with all sorts of girls, and he is an accomplished athlete. He is a wrestler who his neighbor said he had video, although he couldn't find it, video of Aaron Fisher at like 11 years old kicking the shit out of another adult male neighbor in a kind of an impromptu wrestling competition. He was a track star. I mean, this guy, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, and there's no evidence for it. And yet, here we are, this injustice will never be corrected.
Well, this has been a very revealing story, John. I do question, why people cave into stuff like this. I don't know if we'll ever know. It's
the human condition. We're very weak and oftentimes very dumb.
Well, I think a lot of this is just, some women who want to take out, this is another blow to the patriarchy. take out Jerry Sandusky, whoever it's.
I do believe that Sarah Ganem, the Pulitzer Prize winning fraud, I do believe that that was kind of part of her narrative. And the media loved the idea of this young woman, incredibly young woman who was a Penn State grad, bringing down the vaunted Penn State football program. They loved that. That was, and let's not be naive. The fact that Paterno was seen as a Republican, which was absolutely the case,
Yes.
did not help when it came to the news media coverage. The news media was absolutely orgasmic over the opportunity to destroy this guy who they, I guess, thought of as a hypocrite and was a fraud, because here he was, this goody two-shoes Republican, and he was supposedly enabling child sex abuse. They loved that narrative. Loved it, but it was false.
And, I had never heard anything negative anywhere about Joe Paterno ever.
Well, that's one of the many, many parts of this story that's so bizarre. Imagine living a public life of half a century under incredible pressure and never, ever having fallen, never having any legitimate allegations of wrongdoing. I mean, in a world where you're swimming with sharks in college football, right? Imagine and winning 2 national championships and having other undefeated seasons and winning more games than anyone else has in the history of college football. Imagine all of that being thrown out in 3 days with no benefit of the doubt and no evidence because you get caught up in a moral panic. We just decided to toss out Joe Paterno's entire life story based upon a grand jury presentment with no actual evidence. No one had even publicly testified yet. We didn't even know the names of any of these accusers. We didn't know the name of the boy in the shower. We knew nothing. And it was Salem witch trial. And Joe Paterno got destroyed. And it's totally unfair.
Yeah, it is. I'm a lifelong Mountaineer. I've never been a Penn State fan either. So, but it just, and I don't know what percentage of his players graduated.
Oh, yeah. I mean, by every measure, Joe Paterno was exactly what college football should be about. And I do think it's not coincidental, and it's almost, in a weird way, appropriate, that ever since this happened, the entire structure of college football has been destroyed. It's almost like we're just eliminating the entire history of the sport. Now, this is a completely different subject, but we're just eliminating the entire history of the sport because somehow it was corrupt or it was bad, and I think that it's symbolic that a lot of that started to happen after Joe Paterno was destroyed. And here he was, really the best that college football had to offer in many ways. And he gets destroyed. And now, things that were never even dreamed as possible are happening on a daily basis with regard to NIL and instant transfers and players, leaving and not playing in bowl games and coaches leaving teams and alerts. I mean, it's just horrendous. I used to be a huge college football fan, and I can no longer get passionate about it.
He really was kind of the last of those old school coaches. Can't really think of anybody else who was around at the time.
Well, I think Nick Saban kind of had that mantle and picked it up for a while, but Saban realized he needed to get the hell out because the world had changed, and he was probably smart to do so.
Yeah, it's really wild. He'd given a lot to that university, and they fired him with a phone call. It's
yeah, over a borrowed cell phone. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I even heard he still had his phone number listed.
Yeah, his phone number was in the phone book throughout almost all of his career. Everyone knew where he lived. Everyone, what his phone number was. It was a completely different era, but that era is now gone forever.
That era is gone. Well, you could say it kind of ended too when Penn State joined the Big Ten, but that's another story. Well, where can we find you out there, John?
Well, I urge people to check out the podcast With the Benefit of Hindsight, which they can find on Apple or on Spotify or elsewhere, I believe. And my Twitter account is where I'm most vocal, which is at Sigmund Freud.
Yes, Sigmund Freud, and I'm wearing my West Virginia 100 anniversary football shirt. It's old. One of the few pieces of clothing I own that I actually bought at Stone and Thomas.
well, Chris, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack, go to buy me a coffee. And thank you, John Ziegler. I'm Chris Baker. We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.